SDSs, or safety data sheets, are one of the main components of WHMIS. These are documents that are created by or at least obtained from the supplier of a product. And these data sheets summarize health and safety information, and they give you tons of information. And they provide most of everything that you need to safely handle, store, and use potentially hazardous chemicals. These are a key element in education, and you've got to be able to read them and understand them. There are 16 sections to a safety data sheet, and all of them need to be present, but at least currently in Canada, sections 12 to 15 don't need anything to be included in them. The section headings are required, but information isn't needed yet, although that will be changing in the future. So there are certainly a large number of required sections, and we're going to go through them all one at a time and look at them in a bit more detail. So section number 1 is identification, and it contains things that you might expect: the name of the chemical product and supplier contact information. It also contains recommended uses and restrictions on use sometimes. Section 2 is hazard identification, and this is effectively all of the information that is found on a supplier label plus a bit more. So this is one of the most useful sections to turn to when you're looking at a new product. Section 3 is composition, or information on ingredients, and this is where you can find really useful things like the chemical name and any synonyms. So lots of chemicals go by different names depending on what kind of naming system you're using. So it's a good place to check to make sure you're actually looking at the information for the right chemical. You'll also find things like the molecular weight, the concentration of the chemical that you're using, and lists of any impurities or stabilizing agents that are used. Section 4 is all about first aid measures, so things that you should be doing to treat exposure to this chemical through different routes of entry. Section 5 is all about firefighting, and the thing that's most useful to you in this section is looking at suitable and unsuitable fire extinguisher media. So should you be using a carbon dioxide or water or sand or what have you to put out a fire that contains this ingredient. And the rest of this section is more relevant to firefighters. Section 6 is what to do when you accidentally spill large amounts of this material. So not a couple of drops on the bench, but more if you spill an entire bottle full of this material all over the floor. Section 7 is related to how to handle the material, how to store the material, and this will tell you things like the temperature or humidity conditions for storing a material, whether it should be isolated from other chemicals, what chemicals it can't be stored with, and things like that. Section 8 is all about exposure controls and personal protection. This is where you find things like exposure limits, what type of engineering or mechanical controls you should be using to stay safe, and what type of personal protective equipment you should be wearing when working with the material. It's possible that you're not familiar with exposure limits. There are way too many to list. Here are a few of them. They're often listed as these acronyms like TWAEV, which is a time-weighted average exposure value. All of these exposure limits are numerical values related to concentrations or absolute amounts of chemical that you can be exposed to in a certain time period before it becomes hazardous, or before the hazard becomes too large. And you'll never be able to remember all of these acronyms. Certainly there are more than the 4 that are listed here. So if you encounter one, you should look up the acronym and see what it means. Engineering controls are mechanical built-in systems that prevent exposure to chemicals. So things like fume hoods or glove boxes are mechanical systems. Personal protective equipment, however, is something that you wear on your body. So safety goggles or gloves or a lab coat could all be considered PPE. Section 9 is one of the most useful sections of a safety data sheet. It lists chemical and physical properties, things like appearance and odor, and pH and flammability limits, that kind of thing. And often these properties are useful for assessing risk, specifically things like appearance and odor and vapor pressure. Flammability limits, or explosive limits, are numerical ranges for concentrations of a chemical vapor in the air, and within those two limits, the material can burn or explode. So the lower flammability limit, or the lower explosive limit, is the same thing, just a different name. And the UFL, or UEL, is the upper flammable limit, or upper explosive limit. And these are, again, concentrations in the air where numbers between the LFL and UFL represent concentrations that support ignition or support explosions. Section 10 is all about stability and reactivity. So this is where you would find out if a chemical will spontaneously decompose, or if it will react dangerously, or if it will self-react. You can also find out about any materials that should not be mixed with this chemical to avoid dangerous reactions. Section 11 is all about toxicology. It's all about how poisonous or how toxic the chemical is. So it includes quantifications of toxicity like LD50 or LC50. It lets you know if the material is carcinogenic or if it's teratogenic, things like this. So within this section, toxicological information, you'll see two different types of effect. Acute effects that are happening quickly or after a single exposure. And it's important to remember that acute just means fast. It doesn't mean necessarily serious. So you can have a very mild acute effect or a very dangerous acute effect. And you'll also see reference to chronic effects. These are things that develop over a long period of time or after repeated low doses. And again, these can be very mild or very severe. This section deals with quantification of toxicity, and one of the ways that we quantify toxicity is using an LD value, a lethal dose. And typically we use a lethal dose 50, an LD 50 value. This is the dose of a chemical, either by ingestion or absorption or injection, that will kill half of a test population. And it's a standardized measure that is calculated relative to the mass of the test animal. So typically the units are milligrams of chemical per kilogram of test animal, or this is also known as ppm. There are other LD values. There are LD zeros, LD 100s, but the one that is used most often is the LD 50. We also have LC50s, so lethal concentrations, which is the concentration in air that will kill 50% of a test population. So LC50s are related to animals breathing in a material, and LD50s are for animals swallowing, injecting, or absorbing those materials. You'll also see reference to routes of entry, and you'll see language like oral ingestion, oral inhalation, dermal absorption, injection, or ocular absorption. And these different things refer to chemicals entering through the mouth, the nose, the skin, or the eyes. So these are the four primary routes of entry, the four primary ways that chemicals can enter the body. Starting at section 12, we have the asterisks where, under Canadian rules, currently only the headings are required. Section 12 is all about ecological information. Here is where you will find information that quantifies how toxic a chemical is to aquatic or terrestrial organisms. It's where you would look if your symbol had the pictogram with the dying fish and the dead tree. Section 13 should be one of the most important sections in the whole safety data sheet, but it typically isn't. This is where you find how to dispose of a chemical. But unfortunately, because these are legal documents, they typically don't actually tell you how to dispose of a material. They say something like, please dispose of in accordance with local regulations. If you're shipping chemicals, Section 14 has useful information related to transporting chemicals. Section 15 is related to regulatory information for chemicals. And Section 16 is a miscellaneous category. Typically, the most important thing found in Section 16 is the latest revision date for the safety data sheet. When was it last updated? Although a supplier can put pretty well anything it wants into this section. And it's important to check the latest revision date. Safety data sheets need to be updated within 90 days of the chemical supplier being made aware of any significant new data. So not something like adding an extra decimal place to a density in physical properties, but something where the safety information has changed dramatically.